Norms regulate. Formal dress required, whatever that might mean. This is an ex-ante rule enforced by a community. And not just norms regulate, the market regulates. We'll pay you $15 an hour. That might be high, that might be low, but whatever it is, it has an effect. It has a regulation. It's a simultaneous regulation enforced through code, property, and contract. And then finally, most relevant to the internet, the architecture, the code of the environment regulates. And this regulation in real space and in cyberspace is simultaneous, but enforced by the maker, the God. So my favorite MIT t-shirt, 186,000 miles per second. It's not just a good idea, it's the law, the speed of light. So these four modalities regulate together. And we always have to think about how they complement or conflict. And then we must think that if these are the regulators, what regulates the regulators? Now, 25 years ago, as a younger law professor, I, of course, thought it was law that was the regulator of the regulators. So, for example, think about the regulation of smoking. The law might say no smoking indoors. That has an effect on the prevalence of smoking. But the law could also decide to try to affect the norms around smoking by putting up signs or posters or advertising that makes smoking seem uncool or unhealthy, thereby increasing the normative costs of smoking. Or the law could regulate the market by taxing cigarettes, which of course it has. In America we also subsidize tobacco production, but put that to one side. Increasing the cost, thereby driving down the demand for cigarettes. And then in the United States, under the Clinton administration, there was a period of time when they were considering thinking of cigarettes as nicotine delivery devices and regulating the quantity of nicotine in these devices to thereby decrease the addictiveness of that technology, using architecture as a regulator. And so when you think about the way law can muck up each of these kinds of regulators, you naively think, you young law professor think that law is at the center. And in that book, the point I wanted to make, of course, was that it's always a mix, and that mix can change, and it can be changed, and that there would be incentives to change it, incentives by those who don't benefit from the architecture as it was, who might want to see it become a different architecture so that they could benefit from that. And my claim way back then was that the architecture of freedom that the internet originally was, John Perry Barlow sang about, EFF celebrated, all these great organizations said, this is what the internet is, that architecture of freedom would become an architecture of control. Now that fact seemed obvious to me, it wasn't. When I first presented this at a tech conference, a woman came up, a programmer, and she told me, look, in tears, she said, I don't do politics. That's not what I do. Code is not politics because I'm just a technician. And when I published the book, New York Times asked, at that date, Pogue is, of course, a brilliant writer, at that time mainly computer manuals, but they asked David Pogue to review the book, and David's review said, Lessig plays digital Cassandra and predicts the internet will become a monster that tracks our every move, but that nobody will heed his warning. These discussions are thoughtful and measured, but the premise that frames them all is shaky. Lessig doesn't offer much proof that a Soviet-style loss of privacy and freedom is on its way. And unlike actual law, internet software has no capacity to punish. It doesn't affect people who aren't online, only a tiny minority of the world's population is. And if you don't like the internet system, you can always flip off the modem, which of course is true. Okay, so 25 years later, I want to confess, it hasn't taken me 25 years to recognize this, but now, 25 years later, let me confess there was something in this. And the something was to recognize that law is not on top of this model. The market is on the top of this model. Law is not the king. The market is the king. The business model of the internet rules in the context of the internet. And advertising is, or has become, that business model. It wasn't supposed to be. When these kids founded Google, they wrote proudly, advertising-funded search engines will be inherently biased towards the advertisers and away from the needs of the consumers. Very quickly, when they learned they needed to actually make money to run their servers, they embraced that bias and began to build out an infrastructure of advertising. And very quickly, their genius technical engineers identified the fact that advertising needs data, personal data, private data. And the more data it has, the better the ads will be. And so the need was to induce users to reveal more. Now, it could do that in a number of ways. It could do that, of course, by deploying applications that led people to behave in ways that revealed tons to those who were trying to sell advertising. But most importantly, it could begin to modify the very architecture of the environment within which people lived on the internet. My friend Tristan Harris, who was a Google engineer, and then recognized he needed to flee Google because of what Google was doing in this space and start the Center for Humane Technology, describes how at Google he was studying, and within a group that studied, the science of attention. The practice of using AI to engineer the attention of users, to overcome their natural resistance to increase engagement with the platforms. It was through a kind of brain hacking, as he described it. Now, what's brain hacking? Well, think about body hacking first. It's more familiar, perhaps. Body hacking is the science of using food science to engineer food, to exploit evolution, the mix of salt, sugar, and fat, to overcome a natural resistance we would otherwise have to eating too much so that we can't stop eating, and thereby they can sell more food. That's body hacking. Brain hacking is the same with respect to attention. It's about exploiting evolution, the fact that we react to random rewards in a particular way, or that we can't stop consuming bottomless wells of content, with the aim to increase engagement so that they can better model you. Learn who you are. Are you type 14,226 or type 1,224? Learn who you are so that they can better sell you ads. So this is the use of architecture, and then it's also the change in norms that makes this architecture even more valuable as people increasingly take it for granted that life is in real space and in virtual space at the same time. See my kids, these are not my kids, this is an AI version of kids here, constantly living their life with each other, but not with each other, alone together, in a kind of norm that embraces the idea this is okay, something I think at the time code was written, it would have been unimaginable. How rude would it be to sit there at the table, pull out a book and just read next to the person you're eating lunch with? But today is just unavoidable. And then in addition, the market has a pretty dramatic effect on law. The effect it has on law in the United States, I have extraordinary admiration for the Brits and for the Europeans and the Canadians, where this is not necessarily true, or not necessarily true yet. But in the United States, the effect the market has on law is to basically make law invisible. To use the extraordinarily corrupt infrastructure of campaigns in the United States to block the opportunity of regulators to do anything effective to counter the effect of these market-driven regulations. All of this is for a business model. And this business model has effects. Some of these are individual effects, the effects of addictions, depression, and the consequences of social media for both of those. But the more important effects are the cultural or political effects. Because it just so happens, too bad for us, but it just so happens that we engage more extreme, the more polarizing, the more hate-filled the content is that is fed on these platforms. So that is what we're fed. With the consequence that this ideal of democracy, we the people, becomes we the polarized, ignorant, and angry, and thereby is democracy weakens. And some think to the point of also almost total collapse. This is AI's effort to represent this. Because when you think about the extraordinary events on January 6th, these, of course, in my view, are criminals, but they are also people who actually believed something. They believed an election had been stolen. And they believed that in overwhelming percentages. 70% of Republicans believed the election was stolen. And not just uneducated, more than a majority of the college degree Republicans believed the election was stolen. And they acted on that belief, whether appropriately or not, they acted on that belief, and they believed this because of a diet of engagement that they were fed that allowed them to believe what they wanted to believe, because that's the market's successful way of driving engagement. Tell you what you want to hear. You'll read more and more and more of it. And when they read this, they were led to behave in ways which, of course, were deeply destructive of our democracy. But none of this is surprising. Zynak Confecci wrote many years before this, companies are in the business of monetizing attention, and not necessarily in ways that are conducive to health or the success of social movements or the public sphere. That's a little bit understated. We should recognize they are in the business of monetizing intention in ways they know will not be healthy to the success of social movements or society. They know it, but they can't do anything about it because they are competitive businesses in a competitive market that need to do what they need to do to make money. All of this is because of the business model. Now, the consequences here, this is the critical point I'll try to make again and again, and we'll try it again. The consequences here are collective. They are public, not private. They are what economists would refer to as an externality from this information ecosystem, an externality, the typical stuff that we think is the role of law to address. But I come from a country, you are in a country, where the presumption is law has no role in this space, because these wrongs, if they're wrongs, these harms, if they're harms, are harms that are individual. So against that background, that updated, that acknowledgement that however naive I was, I'm not quite that naive anymore, naive in lots of ways, but not that naive anymore. What is the place for privacy in this world? As I read and listen and participate at the edges in this debate, it kind of feels to me that privacy is kind of lost. What it's supposed to be, against the background of all of that, kind of lost. I mean, privacy has been about a thing, has been about data. It's about controlling your data. But I want to submit privacy should be about the use of data, the consequences of the use of particular classes of data, and regulations aiming at protecting dignity, given how data will be used, protecting against all the indignity that Shoshana has so powerfully captured in her book and so many others as well. Because regulating a thing like data or thinking about it as if what we're doing is worrying about the regulation of a thing like data, has typically in the United States meant enabling consent. It's been about empowerment and choice. Two words which are like motherhood and apple pie. Who could be against empowerment and choice? I am. I am against empowerment and choice. I am against empowerment and choice because look at what empowerment and choice look like right now. This is the picture most ordinary civilians get when they are told we're talking about privacy. And even worse, if they pause to read any of those, they get this. You indicate by clicking here that you have read and agreed. Well, look, they have not read and agreed to anything. And you know that. You know that no one has read, okay, except you. You have read. But no one except you has read any of this stuff. No one has understood what any of this stuff means. We go through this charade. We imagine that what we're doing is empowering people to make choices, but we know no choices are being made. And so why is it good to force us to pretend, to lie? Why is it okay to force us to live life lying? Because I think this practice is corrosive and corrupting, especially for our kids. Have you had these conversations with your teens where they engage in a behavior which is completely ridiculously, I'm confessing too much about my children here. I've had a conversation with other teens, and they defend ridiculously dishonest behavior, and you kind of get a recognition that they live in a world where they are all the time engaging in dishonest behavior. Some of it we see they do when they open up the internet all the time, and I want you to ask, how is it we're supposed to teach them which dishonesties are okay and which dishonesties are not? I feel like we've become a culture that imagines people can distinguish between the white dishonesties, the yes, I read the cookie promise, and the other ones. And I submit it's an empirical question, whether generations can make that distinction in a useful way. No doubt there are serious problems with today's data economy. But we won't, here's a word I want to invent, individual consentivize our way out of those problems. We won't, through an infrastructure of individual consent, through some invisible hand, drive the society to an ideal mix of sharing and not sharing. It just won't happen. And what that means is we need to think differently about what should be done to address the collective problems data is now creating for our society. I suggest we need to engage in a period of reflection, to step back to first principles. And as a Harvard professor, I'm happy to invoke a Harvard Law Review article from more than 130 years ago from Warren and Brandeis. And way back then, Warren and Brandeis were worried about the way privacy has evolved or was evolving. They said political, social, we should add technological, economic changes entail the recognition of new rights, and the common law in its eternal youth grows to meet the demands of society. And among the principles they wanted to articulate, here's one that I love: the right to be let alone. The idea that you can live in society and have a space where you are not intruded upon. People have this sense. Great Reddit post where they were talking about how Elon's thinking about using the satellites to advertise from space. And this poster said, when that happens, I will become a terrorist. Because there's this deep sense that we need a place where we're not subject to this kind of intrusion. That right to be left alone, I think, is fundamental indeed. And so when we think about privacy, why not to begin to think about building privacy law to give us some of these values, not from the bottom up, but from the top down, giving us a right to be let alone. Why not help build through privacy law what we recognize to be the society that we might collectively say that we want, rather than facilitating the consent necessary to enable the world that the king wants. Because I suggested that's what you did. That's what privacy regulators or tech regulators around the world did. The world would love you again, and forgive you for the cookies notifications, and love you again. Because you would be building a kind of culture and environment that could give us back a sense that we are first. We have a dignity first, and we're not constantly being played by entities that are simply out there trying to make money.